Hey, welcome to Classic Guitar Rock, guys. We've got a daily update for today, March. It's a new month, March 1, 2023. I got some emails and then a few news items that we want to talk about. And one thing very important that happened today in history that I want to talk to. Thanks for joining us. Please shoot me an email, classicguitarrock@mail.com. classicguitarrock@mail.com. Follow us on Twitter at classicguitarr1. That's at classicguitarr1. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. A couple emails. I got a negative email. Awesome. Okay, this says, hey, heard your episode about Quiet Riot being the most important album of the 80s. That's idiotic. If that's the kind of crap you have to say, I won't be listening to your dumb podcast anytime soon. Say it like you mean it, dude. That's from Bill. Thanks, Bill. Seriously, thank you for listening, Bill. Even if you didn't like it, at least you listened. I hope you'll give it another chance. A few things here. First of all, I didn't say that Quiet Riot album was the most important album of the 80s. And in fact, I'm not sure Bill actually listened to the episode. I think he might have just seen the title or something. I can't speak for Bill. That's an interesting episode. So I would direct you. In fact, I saw this email and then just an hour or so, I reposted it on Twitter because I went back and listened to it and I said, that's actually a pretty good episode. And I want people to listen to it. But the point I made in the album or in the podcast is that Quiet Riot album is actually a mediocre album. I mean, I said right up front that it's not one of my favorite albums. The point I made is that it was one of the most important albums of the 80s, and here's why. Well, you should go listen and you'll hear why, but I'll tell you why. The Quiet Riot Metal Health album was the first heavy metal album to ever reach number one. And it opened the doors for what would become the hair metal scene from the Sunset Strip, right? So from that standpoint, that's why it was important. And we get into a lot of things in that episode, the new wave of British heavy metal, how I think Randy Rhoads played a key part in that, even though he was not from England at the time. You got to listen to the episode. Don't let that throw you. And no, I didn't say that that's the most important album of the 80s, but I said it was one of the most important because it was the first metal album to ever achieve number one. And it kind of opened the gate for a lot of the hair bands that came after that. If you're a fan of the new wave of British heavy metal, hair metal, whatever, there's things in that episode that you need to hear. So check it out. But Bill, thank you. And I hope you'll give us another chance. Another email. Dear CGR, while I really enjoy your podcast, I do have a question. How do you define classic guitar rock? Is that just a name or is it different than plain old classic rock? I notice you seem to be a big fan of U2, who I'm not a big fan of, LOL. Do you consider them classic rock or classic guitar rock? What gives? I hope you don't think I'm being snarky because I love the podcast. Just curious. I'll keep listening. That's from BD. BD, thank you. Great question. I call it classic guitar rock. What is that? What does that mean? Did I make that up? Well, I don't know if I made it up. I'm probably not the first person to put those words together, but way back 2010, 2011, I started a blog called the Classic Guitar Rock blog. And to be honest, my first choice was classic rock guitar, but that was already taken. So I took classic guitar rock. And so what is that? In my mind, what classic guitar rock is guitar-driven music, rock music. And that's pretty broad. Now you can look at is it classic rock? Yeah, it overlaps with classic rock. Some folks of classic rock is different. Some people call classic rock only stuff from the 60s and 70s. That's the only stuff that they would consider classic rock. Other folks will call grunge classic rock. The local classic rock station here in Spokane plays Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots. Is that classic rock? So it's all subjective, right? My definition of classic rock is mid 60s to about the end of the 80s. And again, it's subjective, right? So I don't include grunge as classic rock. I mean, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and that's not to say I don't like them, but in my definition, I don't really consider that classic rock. And I don't really cover that a lot in the classic guitar rock world that I've made up in my own head, right? I go to about 80, 88, 89, 65, 66, up to about 89. That's kind of the time frame I'm looking at. And it's guitar-driven type music for the most part. They mention U2. Does U2 get played on classic rock stations? Most classic rock stations play that, so I guess you could say they're considered classic rock. Are they guitar-driven? Very much so. I am a big fan of U2. I think The Edge is brilliant. And I get it that they're kind of irritating and annoying, and yes, they are. But you listen to their music from the early 80s, it's awesome. The Unforgettable Fire album, of course, Joshua Tree, monumental, huge album, very guitar-driven, and the things that they produced in terms of the sonic soundscape is awesome. So yeah, I'm a U2 fan. Some people aren't, but I think they're great. And it's guitar driven. Now there's some bands that I readily bring into my classic guitar rock camp that you probably wouldn't hear on classic rock stations, like Blondie. I love Blondie. The Fix. I bring that into my classic guitar rock tent. Whether or not that's what most people consider classic rock. So what am I saying? I'm saying it's all kind of subjective. So in my mind, at least what I define as classic guitar rock is it's guitar-driven music from the, like mid 60s to like the end of the 80s. It's kind of, and that doesn't mean anything outside of that is crap. I'm not saying any of that, but that's just kind of what I choose to focus on. Hope that helped. And thank you so much. This is from BD. BD, thank you so much for listening. And I hope you'll continue to listen, even if you're not a fan of U2. All right, here's one more. Classic guitar rock, checking in from Highland Park, Michigan, Detroit area. Any love for my favorite Canadian three-piece? And I'm not talking about Rush. Well, who could he be talking about? I'm talking about Triumph, of course. I would love to hear you guys talk about them. We haven't really talked about Triumph. I love Triumph. I think I have talked about them in this context. The only album, I shouldn't say the only album I can think of that I bought based purely on the album cover. I'd never heard of the band, didn't know a thing about them, but I like the album cover. In 1982, I saw the Allied Forces album at Kmart, and I thought it looked cool. And I thought, this band's got to be cool. Look at the album cover, And I bought it. And fortunately, I loved it, right? So that was my introduction to Triumph. After that, I kind of went backwards. Just a Game, a lot of the Progressions of Power, their earlier albums. I love all that as well. Allied Forces I loved. And then they kind of got more mainstream. Thunder 7 and the albums that came on after that. I love Triumph. Super talented. The footage of them at the US Festival in '83 is awesome. If you've not seen that, check it out. They just rocked it. So I'm a huge fan of Triumph, and hopefully we should do an episode just on Triumph, one of their albums or a couple of their albums, or just on the band in general. I'd love to do that. Thank you for listening. That's from Art Loftus, Highland Park. By the way, I've been to Highland Park. My day job, I work for a company that has a big site in Highland Park, so I have been to Highland Park, Michigan. It's awesome. So some news items. One is not really a news item, but just something I want to share just because it was very interesting. One of my favorite YouTube channels is called Full in Bloom. I don't know much about this guy. His last name is Bloom, but Full in Bloom, he does interviews with classic guitar rock figures all the time, right? He's interviewed lots of producers, lots of artists. So if you're a fan of this classic rock from, that we talk about here, you would love Full in Bloom to hear these interviews. In fact, I've tried to get him as a guest on the podcast, and he's kind of like, I appreciate the offer. He says, but I don't, I'm a behind the scenes guy. He's like, I interview these people, but I don't, he wasn't really great, really nice response, but he's like, he didn't want to be the subject of an interview, which I get it. A lot of people don't. But check it out, Full in Bloom. He does little news updates and things too, but he has some great interviews. Well, the interview he posted today was with George Lynch, who I love. George Lynch, man, talk about a great guitar player. George Lynch, by the way, took over teaching a lot of Randy Rhoads' students. When Randy left to join Ozzy, and he can no longer teach at Musonia, his mom's music school, George Lynch took over a lot of his students. I think that's interesting. But anyways, love George. I think he's a phenomenal guitar player. But there were previous interviews with Don Dokken and with Tom Werman. Tom Werman, a famous producer, he's produced Dokken, Ted Nugent, Molly Hatchet, Cheap Trick. He's a pretty well-known producer, and he was the original producer on Tooth and Nail, Dokken's Tooth and Nail album, which came out in, I think, 85. Well, it's historical fact that Don Dokken and George Lynch famously did not get along. Don talks about George being very difficult to work with, and there's a lot of back and forth. That may be true, but it's also true that there are two sides to every story. So I had heard interviews with both Don and Tom Werman about how during the production of Tooth and Nail that George was super hard to work with. He was a pain in the butt, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Well, on the interview today, it's Full in Bloom interviewing George. And they asked George about all of this. And again, I'm not picking sides, right? But George did have some very interesting things to say that made a lot of sense. He talked about Tom Werman. The context is it's talking about Tom Werman, but he applied it to other famous producers. And he even mentioned by name Rick Rubin. And he talked about these producers that, again, I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. Tom Werman and Rick Rubin both have some tremendous albums on their resumes, but neither of them play an instrument, right? Neither of them are engineers. So they don't really know how to get a sound. They're kind of this Svengali figure in the background that supposedly, can pull gold out of these bands and just by motivating them or telling them the right things that they will come up with these masterpiece albums. And George's point was these guys make tons of money. In the case of someone like a Tom Werman or Rick Rubin, they don't know how to engineer. So you can't tell them, here's the sound we're looking for, and they're not able to find that sound. All they can do is really sit back and make suggestions or whatever. And I think the point George makes, which I laughed when he said it, is he used the analogy of Stone Soup, the old story of Stone Soup. The story I know, he told it slightly different, but the story of Stone Soup that I know is these hucksters come into town and they tell the town that they are going to make stone soup. And everyone's like, stone soup, what is that? And they said, all we need is a pot and some water and a stone, and we will make the most amazing soup. And so someone comes and brings them a pot, and someone fills it with water, and someone brings them a stone, and they throw it in, and they start heating up this big pot that just has water and a rock in it. And then they'll say things like, well, if it had some onions in it, that would make it even better. You don't have to have it, but if you had some onions, that would make it even better. So someone brings them an onion. And they said, carrots would make it taste even better. Someone brings a carrot. If we had a little meat to put in it, we don't have to. because Stone Soup is awesome, but if we put a little meat in it, that would make it even. So you see where this is going. Everyone in the village brings and contributes all of this stuff, and then, at the end, basically these hucksters just got a free meal out of the deal by convincing folks that they're making stone soup. The stone had nothing to do with it. It was what everyone else brought that made the stone soup. That's the analogy that George makes about these producers. He says, they really aren't bringing anything to the table other than a reputation, right? They make some suggestions here and there. Well, maybe we should repeat this chorus here. Maybe we should change. He says they make these minor little tweaks, but they really haven't done it. They don't know how to get a sound. They don't know how to play instruments. They don't sing. They don't do anything other than just make these suggestions. In the meantime, they're getting paid more than the artists get paid. And, you kind of see his point. He says it's the engineers that do all the work. The engineers come in early, get everything ready. They record everything. They EQ everything. They do all the work. And then, and they're just paid by the producer. So Tom Werman, Rick Rubin, these guys make all the money, and then they pay the engineer a lot less who's actually doing all the work. So I just thought, that's a very interesting insight, and probably a lot of truth to that. And he said, you could take have Rick Rubin produce 10 albums. 5 of them will probably be successful, 5 of them probably be a failure, right? He said, bring a homeless guy off the street, have them produce 10 albums. 5 would probably be successful, 5 would probably be a failure. So, not a lot of respect was shown, but you know what? Good for George, because I think he's probably making a valid point here. He says Tom Werman eventually left on the production of Tooth and Nail, I think, and they brought in, they let the engineer finish it, and they're like, well, the engineer's the one doing everything so why in the heck are we paying these producers all this money? But just a fascinating, blunt conversation with George Lynch. I think you'd enjoy it. That's Full in Bloom. It was posted earlier this morning, so I would recommend you check that out. All right, couple news items. Extreme. Remember Extreme? Extreme had a few big hits in the late 80s, 88, 89 to 90, around that time. And of course, Gary Cherone was in Van Halen for the Van Halen 3 album and did a tour. Extreme will release a new album called 6 on June 9th. This is from Ultimate Classic Rock. The Boston Hard Rockers are previewing the record with the first single, Rise. You can check out that. So it's probably on YouTube now. You can find it, which you can listen to. 6, which is indeed the group's 6th album, also marks Extreme's first LP in nearly 15 years. In a press release, guitarist Nuno Bettencourt said he found musical inspiration for the record when one of his longtime heroes died. Quote, when Eddie Van Halen passed away, it really hit me, Bettencourt said. Quote, I'm not going to be the one who will take the throne, but I felt some responsibility to keep guitar playing alive. So you hear a lot of fire on the record. Nuno Bettencourt is a great guitarist. In fact, he was at the Super Bowl. If you watched the halftime of the Super Bowl, you saw Nuno Bettencourt. Don't know if he was playing live or if he was just, I guess you don't call it lip syncing on the guitar, but many of those performances are lip synced or they're canned. So I'm not sure if he was really playing live, but you did see him. He still looks great, by the way. And he's always been a great player. Yeah, he's awesome. So Gary Cherone, of course, in Van Halen, we mentioned, he says, with Extreme, there's always a lot of passion and a little piss and vinegar. So you have that to look for. He says, quote, we're not in competition with anybody else, but we strive to outdo ourselves. There are some moments on this album where we did. We've managed to stay together after all these years. We feel like we have something to prove when we get on stage or in the studio. Because of that, I believe some of these songs are among the best we've written. So if you're a fan of Extreme, Porno Graffiti was their big album. I think about 88, something like that. 89. They had a lot of hits. Of course, More Than Words. Big ballad, big song. So check that out. Also, for about the 20th time, Kiss has announced that they will conclude their end of the road farewell tour. How long have we This is one long end of the road. This end of the road has lasted a couple years now, it seems like. They're saying they have two shows on December. Oh, no, two December 2023 shows at Madison Square Garden. Those will be the last two shows. But guys, don't hold your breath. I would not be surprised if there are some surprise dates that pop up after that. We'll just see. Because, well, the end of the road has been pretty lucrative for Kiss. Whatever you think of the quality of the performances or whatever, they're making money hand over fist. They're still a huge draw. So, again, this also from Ultimate Classic Rock. Paul Stanley revealed that the band will perform at their hometown's most famous venue on December 1st and 2nd. He said this on the Howard Stern show is where he said it. Okay, he announced it on the 1st and 2nd of December. That'll be the last shows. That'll be just shy of 51 years after they played their first show on January 30th, 1973 at the Popcorn Club in nearby Queens. It has been over. Kiss launched the End of the Road tour in January 2019. What is this, 2023? Holy cow. It's one long tour. Putting the track on pause in 2020 due to the pandemic, resuming in the summer of 2021. So there you go. But do you think this is the real end? I doubt it. But there you go. Okay, now, one other thing I wanted to talk about today. On this day, I'm going to the Classic Guitar Rock Twitter page. Are you a follower? Okay, here's something that I posted earlier today. I'm going to refer to it so I get my information right, if I can find it. Okay. On this date in 1973, Pink Floyd released their 8th studio album, The Dark Side of the Moon, in the U.S. Okay, so it was this day in 73. On this date in 1973, Dark Side of the Moon was released. Here's the fascinating part. It remained in the U.S. charts for 741 discontinuous weeks from 73 to 88, meaning that I think the original run was like 600 and something weeks on the chart. It left the chart for a while and then came back a few different times, right? 741 discontinuous weeks from 73 to 88, longer than any other album in history. After moving to the Billboard Top Pop catalog chart, the album notched up a further 759 weeks and had reached a total of over 1,500 weeks on the combined charts by May 2006. So an estimated 45 million copies sold. And they did it it's the long game, right? That's from 73 to 2006. That is amazing. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about Dark Side of the Moon. Do you own Dark Side of the Moon? Are you a fan of Dark Side of the Moon? Let me know. And I'll tell you, I'll just be honest. I have a love-hate relationship with Pink Floyd. I have always liked David Gilmour's playing. So even when I didn't really consider myself a Pink Floyd fan, there was nothing better than hearing David Gilmour, like the soloing on Comfortably Numb. It's just iconic. So I've always been a fan of David Gilmour. You know, one of the coolest things to watch, by the way, back in about 99, 2000, maybe 99, 2000, Paul McCartney did a live broadcast from the Cavern Club in England. It's not the original Cavern Club. They had to they basically rebuilt another Cavern Club because the original one was torn down. But there's still a place called the Cavern Club, and Paul McCartney did a live concert. They didn't call it streaming back then, but it was a streaming concert. It was a live concert from the Cavern Club, and his guitar player was David Gilmour. And it's so awesome to see David Gilmour with a flat top haircut, playing a Telecaster, all of these old rockabilly songs. It's really cool. If you can find that, I haven't looked for it in a while. I imagine it's on YouTube somewhere. Just look up Paul McCartney live at the Cavern Club. Who knew that David Gilmour was such a rockabilly? It's awesome to see him ripping off these rockabilly licks. Really cool. Anyways, that's an aside. Let's talk about Dark Side of the Moon and this love-hate relationship. I've always been a fan of David Gilmour, but what bugged me about Pink Floyd is it's always so depressing. Everything they did was just so depressing. And it was hard for me to listen to that. And I got to be honest, it's only been about the last 10 years or so that I've really gained more of an appreciation to Pink Floyd. And I can tell you that I've listened to every single Pink Floyd album. I don't own every single one. I own, I don't know, 4 or 5 of them on vinyl. And I've grown a bigger appreciation of them. And I see, I'm starting to understand the draw, right? And Dark Side of the Moon is really the album that did that for me. When you think about the context, when it was produced, the technology that existed that they used, in fact, they invented many of the things that are now commonplace on that album. A lot of things didn't exist that we have now. This was like the very beginning of sequencers, for instance. And they introduced a lot of that. This use of sound effects and noise and all the things. Alan Parsons, who I love, a huge fan of Alan Parsons. His job on Dark Side of the Moon was actually collecting a lot of the sound effects. Sometimes they would find a sound effect in the BBC sound effects library, or it might be that there's one story he talks about where he literally recorded all kinds of different clocks and brought it all together in the there are a couple places on the album where you hear all the clocks, right? The intro to Money, the sound effect there, that was collected from Roger Waters recording sounds at his home studio. So there's just so many cool things that happened on that album that comes together in such a sonic masterpiece. The playing is brilliant. You know, it wasn't the first theme album, but it was one of the first, right? It was a theme. There was a theme throughout that they developed. And Roger Waters, as he's sometimes a controversial figure, but he was brilliant in terms of the songwriting. And David Gilmour never gets enough credit as a vocalist. He's a phenomenal singer. And it just all comes together in a great album that you should lay down and listen to in headphones. So if you've never done that with Dark Side of the Moon, if you're not a big Pink Floyd fan, I would challenge you, invite you to check out that album. And it took me a long time to come to the Pink Floyd table, right? I just you know, I'd hear Comfortably Numb, or I'd hear Another Brick in the Wall, and I'm like, it's okay. Oh, a great guitar solo. I like that. I can deal with that. But I have gone back now and have gained a bigger appreciation. And it was because of this album, really. Obscured by Clouds has become one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums. And I Wish You Were Here, great album. The Wall, a great album. Some people love Animals. Animals I haven't really warmed up to like other folks have. But today, as a celebration of history, you know, my invitation to you is to listen to Dark Side of the Moon. You can stream it if you don't have a copy, but it's a piece of classic rock history. And every time I listen to it, I'm reminded of these guys. They were brilliant. And that was a great album. So check it out. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Thank you so much for listening here or watching here on YouTube. If you aren't a subscriber yet, please do so. Follow us on Twitter, and please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. ClassicGuitarRock@mail.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Classic Guitar Rock. Bye-bye.